Happy New
Year! Would you like to save yourself 12 minutes per week of listening to ads like this?
Well, Club Retrospectors members get an ad-free feed on their podcast app, plus weekly bonus bits and freshly baked episodes every Sunday.
And right now, you can try being a member for free. Visit patreon.com/retrospectors for a week's free trial. Or click subscribe on Apple Podcasts for a 14-day free trial.
That's patreon.com/retrospectors or click subscribe in Apple Podcasts.
And hurry, because the offer ends January the 18th.
It's January 15th, 1919, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Arion, Rebecca, and Olly, the Retrospectors.
It was today in history in 1919 that a bizarre industrial accident triggered what would come to be known as the Great Molasses Flood, unleashing a tidal wave of sweet, sticky death on the unsuspecting citizens of Boston, Massachusetts.
Yeah, the Boston Globe reported that people were picked up by a rush of air and hurled many feet. Other people were hit by debris. It was carrying this huge surge of molasses and sweet-smelling air. And I think that's what's so captivating about this event. It is a tragedy, but with this element of almost frivolity, like our London beer flood of 1814 episode. It sounds fun on paper, being swept away by this tide of deliciousness. But as you dig into the details, it really isn't that terribly fun.
Indeed. So 150 people were injured on this day. 21 people were killed, including, tragically, 2 10-year-olds. And although you're right about the beer flood, that kind of sounding fun, and then you go into the details and it doesn't, I'm not sure that this is the case here. Because as soon as you sort of realise in your mind what it would be like to drown in molasses. And by the way, for British listeners who aren't exactly sure what molasses is, it's basically dark syrup. So in the US, it's called molasses. Here, it's more commonly referred to as black treacle, i.e. one of the very worst liquids to drown in.
Yeah, and I mean, there is the expression slow as molasses, but this was not a slow flood because of the force of the explosion. It was travelling at about 35 miles an hour, and the wave of molasses reached as high as 8 meters. So it was striking people extremely unaware. I mean, not what you expect. I feel bad saying this because his mother did die, but Martin Clofferty was one of the victims who spoke to the press afterwards, and their home was near the tank of molasses. But he would later tell reporters, the first impression I had that something unusual had happened was when I awoke in several feet of molasses. And this was like on the top floor of his house, just waking up suddenly with the room full of molasses. That's how fast this was moving.
Now, there was a kind of culprit at the centre of this disaster, and his name was Arthur Gell. He was the treasurer of the Purity Distilling Company. He was an ambitious, kind of career-minded guy, and he was tasked with overseeing the construction of a massive molasses storage tank on Commercial Street in Boston's North End. And the tank was set to hold millions of gallons of molasses imported from Cuba. It was intended to be processed into industrial alcohol, which could then be converted into munitions, weirdly, for World War I, or also distilled into beverages. It can be used as a component of making alcohol. And Gell's motivation was primarily personal and financial, because the president of US Industrial Alcohol, which was the parent company of his company, had promised him a promotion to a vice presidency in the New York office and a huge salary bump if he successfully completed this tank project. But failure, by contrast, was going to be a threat to his career and also his professional reputation. And so he felt this intense burden to meet this quite tough deadline, because the tank was meant to receive an incredibly large shipment of molasses by the end of December in 1918. And so he was basically kind of rushing to get this thing done. And that led to a few, shall we say, oversights.
Yes, corners being cut, which is the point, isn't it? I mean, I think some people would take from what you said, oh, this is a case of American corporate greed. Let's build it bigger and better than everyone else. Let's have the biggest molasses tank. But it's not because of the size of it, actually, because if the size of it was built responsibly, you know, like a nuclear power station, then it would have been safe. The point was it wasn't safe. The locals knew that it leaked already. Local kids used to collect the residue that spilled out of it, like collecting sap from a tree. It was a kind of local attraction amongst the youth. And so it was exactly the fact that it was done quickly, that it hadn't been built properly, that was the problem. And at this time of year, which seems strange to say in January, it was unseasonably warm. And this is why the tank eventually was thought to have cracked. It was the change in weather combined with a recent delivery.
Yeah, there was another temperature change there too, because molasses was warmed for transportation because it made it thinner and easy to transport. So you had warm molasses going into the cold molasses in the tank, and then temperature changing. And it would later come out in court because in United States industrial alcohol were taken to court. This was the first ever successful class action lawsuit in US history. So all of these details came out. So you had the temperature changes. You also had the fact that the tank was only 1 inch thick. It was holding 9.5 million litres of molasses. And the steel that was used to build it was defective. It didn't contain enough manganese, which made it very brittle. And then obviously, in conjunction with that temperature change, the pressure was just too much. And it would later transpire too that a whistleblower had already tried to flag the danger to Purity's owners, United States Industrial Alcohol, and they were unconcerned. The cracks that you mentioned were just caulked over, and the whole tank was painted brown so that the leaking would be less obvious rather than stopping the leaking. They're just like, well, no one will notice if we just paint the whole thing the colour of molasses.
Yeah, they were literally papering over the cracks. And this is the funny thing that, the reason that there was so much death and devastation is partly because of this sort of curious quality of molasses, which is a non-Newtonian fluid. That means its viscosity changes under stress. So it can be soft as it moves, but then hard on impact. And
non-Newtonian fluid.
Yes, exactly. So
Did you learn that this week?
And stops
Be honest.
moving. Yes, I did.
I've never heard that
This isn't
phrase
something
before.
that I've been carrying around.
But there was a non-Newtonian fluid. We all
we'd all be on top of that. Well, no, I cribbed that from Scientific American, which had the following quote. It said, "A wave of molasses does not behave like a wave of water. A wave of molasses is even more devastating than a typical tsunami. In 1919, the dense wall of syrup surging from its collapsed tank initially moved fast enough to sweep people up and demolish buildings, only to settle in a more gelatinous state that kept people trapped." So that was the thing, that it could quickly cover you over, but then after it had stopped moving, it quickly set, and people got trapped in it really, really easily.
Yes, and that's the really horrible thing about the Boston Globe's reports that you read from earlier. Warning, I'm going to go into a bit more detail here. There was no escape from the wave. Caught, human being and animal alike could not flee. Running in it was impossible. So that's the viscosity you're talking about, right? Mm-hmm. Snared in its flood was to be stifled. Once it smeared a head, human or animal, there was no coughing off the sticky mass. To attempt to wipe it with hands was to make it worse. Most of those who died from suffocation. It plugged nostrils almost airtight.
Yeah, some of the people who did manage to pull themselves out of the flood died soon after, precisely because of that reason. Their heads were just completely submerged in this rapidly sort of hardening molasses. And it was very difficult as well for the first responders on the scene to get to them. There were people on the scene immediately. Some of them were Navy cadets. Their training ship was docked in the harbour, so they were rushed to the scene. Of course, you had police, firemen, Red Cross workers, but they couldn't, imagine trying to get people out of this. And even for weeks afterwards during the cleanup, they were finding bodies as they were getting through these piles of hardened molasses. It was really, really horrifying. And there were accounts of people being brought to hospital so thickly covered that you couldn't tell if they were a man or a woman. You couldn't even see their faces because they were covered in this stuff. And nurses who were working with aprons covered in molasses and blood, it was really very shocking stuff. And of course, so many people were in shock. People died of shock as well, because you don't expect to be hit by a 35-mile-an-hour, 8-meter tall ball of molasses.
And there was hardly any warning either, just a little rumbling beforehand. And as we mentioned earlier, the sort of unseasonable warmth meant there were kids playing in the streets, so there were more child victims than you might have expected as well. And a lot of really quite pathetic improvisation as people try to resolve the issue with these buildings that have been reduced to rubble and covered in this liquid, including the fire station itself, by the way. I mean, talking about emergency workers, the fire station was completely turned to rubble. So emergency workers couldn't access the equipment they needed. And so people are using torches and welding equipment and whatever they can to try and get in there.
Yeah, they figured out that the only way to shift the molasses was to blast it with salt water, which they did because Commercial Street, where this was taking place, was on the harbour front. They used fireboat hoses to blast it with salt water, and the runoff apparently turned the water in the harbour brown for months afterwards.
Whoa.
Yeah, disgusting.
Yeah. There was actually kind of an upshot of this case, which was that it happened to be at this time in 1919 when the progressive movement is probably at its peak in the US, trying to raise awareness of the need to have health and safety essentially across all industries. And this was the perfect example of why that was needed. So, and over the years that followed, regulations were tightened to make it mandatory, for instance, to involve an engineer and an architect and a building inspector when you were doing industrial construction.
And to take some responsibility if accidents do happen and not try and, pretend that they didn't. I mean, rather than put their hands up initially, the owners claimed it had been a bomb in the tank. And then even after the lawsuit happened, there were many people who they denied damages to because they weren't primary victims. For example, you mentioned the Cloughertys earlier. Stephen Clougherty had been eating lunch with his mum when the force of the molasses hurled them both into the street. His mother died. He didn't. He died later in an insane asylum. And his family would then argue for years afterwards that was directly caused by the trauma that he sustained in the flood that killed his mum. But they were awarded no damages for his death because what's his mental health got to do with an exploding tank of molasses? Never mind that he's just seen his mother suffocate in syrup.
Yeah, and the legacy was felt in a very real way in Boston for decades afterwards because visitors noticed a distinct whiff of molasses in the air whenever the weather got warm. This went on for years and for decades afterwards. I don't know how much of it was maybe like sort of mental association, but it does seem like people said that the whole city smelled like molasses because people sort of trampled it around. Like people went to the site either to help or just to like see all of the molasses, and then they were tracking it through like the subways and on the city buses. So eventually the whole city of Boston smelled like syrup.
I mean, that is actually a nice smell if you don't associate it with the horrific event, isn't it?
I think you probably would associate with the horrific event. Yeah.
Well, something smells delicious, but in a sort of non-Newtonian way. What could that
be? Tomorrow.
They picked Dr. No because it was judged to be the simplest and cheapest story to film.
Ditch the ads and get a Sunday episode when you join Club Retrospectors. Patreon.com/retrospectors.